Hello, and welcome back to the Camera Rolling Podcast, Season 2, Episode 1. I'm your host, Ronnie, and today we're going to be talking about a new release, M3GAN. But before I do that, I want to talk about a couple of things first. Number one is I didn't expect to get such a great reception from the Is There Neurodivergent video, but I received a lot more attention on that video than I anticipated, and we got some ableist comments, and not a fan. Most of the criticisms I was receiving had to do with it's not that serious, and it isn't. That's why I said it in the video. And there were some other comments that were just in general ableist or very ignorant. I've mentioned multiple times that I'm autistic, and so my style of filming, my style of making videos may not be for you, but it's how I do it. Moving along, the other thing, of course, I'm going to start off this episode with talking about recent watches. First off, I finally sat down to watch Hereditary. It's a 2018 film by Ari Aster. I think it was actually his debut. He also did Midsummer. It's a psychological horror following a woman and her family after the death of her mother. Afterwards, they start to encounter a lot of creepy stuff. I have to be honest, I'm not sure what my thoughts on it are, because I feel like I just need a little more clarity in regards to some of the things that I'm supposed to take away from the movie. I think the movie's interesting, but I definitely don't know how I'm supposed to feel about it, so I think I'll have to do a little more watching of other people's videos to kind of see what they got from the movie, to see if that also is coming through in my remembering of the movie. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. I also watched a movie called Phobias. It came out in 2021, and it follows 5 different people, kind of like an anthology. The name is self-explanatory. 5 patients at a facility have different phobias, and we get to discover how they got their phobias. I think my main issue with this movie is the aspect of realism. I don't know if many of these stories actually constitute a phobia by the end. Like, one of the girls has a fear of cars, but it seems more like she just suffers from PTSD from a car accident. So, spoiler, but this girl and her boyfriend wanted to rob this other guy. He must have been a business owner or something, because he was carrying a bag of money that one might carry to deposit at the bank after a day of work. But her boyfriend doesn't end up actually robbing the guy, so she decides to hit the guy with her car, and she ends up putting the guy's body in the back of the car, and his soul essentially haunts her. And in doing so, her boyfriend at one point gets out of the car and he leaves because obviously there's a dead body back there and it freaked him out. So now she's the only one in the car and it freaks her out. She's being haunted essentially, and she ends up being in a car accident. However, this doesn't keep her from getting in a car later. Towards the end, they get into a van to escape the facility that they're at, and she doesn't seem to have any problem with getting into this vehicle. It just bothers me that a lot of the times when movies or just media includes mental illnesses, they almost always misrepresent it when they don't have to. Like, I would have just watched a movie about 5 patients seeing the same psychiatrist, and they all have these particular stories and not necessarily phobias. Either way, let's jump into M3GAN. I'm not sure if I'm actually going to be giving spoilers, but if you don't like spoilers, then I would just suggest not watching the video. Anyway, M3GAN, or M3GAN, is about a woman making a robot for her niece. The robot, M3GAN, uses AI and develops a mind of her own. Now, if you've seen anything regarding M3GAN, you've probably seen that weird dance/fight sequence that was in a lot of the advertisements for the movie. And these ads and trailers garnered a lot of attention and also brought up the question of if the movie is actually a horror movie. It also gained a lot of traction as a meme within the queer community and has been loosely called camp. So it got me thinking after having watched it, because I watched it and there were lots of laughs in the theater, so it made me wonder, is this movie camp? But first, I want to talk about the definition of camp, because camp is very much tied to film and media, even though it applies to really any art form. Specifically film and media, it's so easy to see how an entire movie can be campy. If you're unfamiliar, the general definition of camp is something so outrageously artificial, affected, inappropriate, or out of date as to be considered amusing. But a 1964 essay by Susan Sontag goes into extensive detail about the definition of camp. So I figured after having watched this and hearing people call this movie campy, that this would be a good movie to sort of investigate through the lens of the camp definition and see how well it fits into it. So Susan Sontag actually goes into 58 different points in regard to camp in her essay, Notes on Camp. So I'm not going to go through all 58 because that's a lot, but I do think that there are some instances that should be brought up and different parts where it seems like you can pull a point from it, and she kind of continues and explains, and I'm going to explain through the lens of M3GAN. I'm also going to include some quotes and examples from the essay because I think it's important to hear directly from Susan Sontag. So number 1, camp relies on the stylization and artificial nature instead of the overall beauty of the work. I think this particularly comes into play when you look at the way that the movie is styled in general, and also in the set design. The set design is where I noticed it the most. In some instances, it seems very overdone, very clinical in a way, when you look at set designs such as the room that Katie and M3GAN interact in front of an audience. They have this wall-to-wall white room that feels very sterile, and yet they put a bunch of children's toys and tables and activities in there, and it feels very strange, very uncanny. And obviously, I think most people know that when you put something in a white room, it's going to feel that way. So I want to guess that part of that was intentional. Whereas you have on the other end of the spectrum a set design like the exterior of the home that Gemma, the main character, sort of lives in. So if you haven't seen the movie, Gemma is sort of the main character. She's the adult in the film. She's the character who makes the doll. You also have Katie. Katie is the niece, the little girl. Her parents pass away, and so that's why she goes to live with Gemma. And then, of course, M3GAN is the doll. The way that I read some of Sontag's points is that camp is not always subjective, but more so it transforms the experience of something. So something can become camp over time. Some examples that Sontag gives that are pretty easy to look at and see that might be camp, or that may have been campy during the time, but maybe not now. Something like Swan Lake, Tiffany lamps, the 1933 King Kong, 1920s women's fashion like feather boas and the extravagance of that, as well as Scopatone films. Part of why I bring up the stylization is that what Susan Sontag is saying in other points is that the visual nature of camp is part of the essence of camp. That's why art forms like dance, film, fashion, and interior design hold a lot of campy content. There's also just an unpretentious nature to camp as well. From a pretentious point of view, camp can be considered bad or kitsch, but it doesn't actually mean that that thing is bad. I think we've all seen bad movies, and not all of those would be considered camp because some things are just bad. Whereas I think we're all familiar with movies like Sharknado that are bad but also very campy. And I think we can all agree that a movie like Sharknado isn't pretentious. It's not trying to be something that it is not, yet it still has very lofty goals in what it's trying to do. And that's the thing that possibly separates M3GAN from this element of camp, is that I think there is a certain level of pretentiousness that it wants to have but doesn't have. And maybe that's exactly why it would be considered campy, is because it's trying at something and failing, at least for me. Another element of camp is that it's unnatural. The crux of camp is its artificiality. She even says, nothing in nature can be campy. While there are things like very extravagant and gaudy type of flowers, the flowers themselves are literally nature. That's the way it is. It can't really be camp, if you want to put it in terms like that. If you haven't noticed, when you look at M3GAN, she doesn't look like a real person, and yet most everyone who doesn't know that she's a robot in the movie is still taken aback and asks if that's a real girl. And I think that that's really funny, that there's so many people that think she looks real enough to ask if that is a girl, or to include M3GAN essentially in the conversation. This happens with the neighbor, it happens with the lady at the day camp, and it happens with the police officer. However, another part of camp is this androgyny and uncanny valley that it can fall into. And I think M3GAN fits perfectly in that uncanny valley. I think something like M3GAN specifically falls into that category because she technically has all the elements that make a little girl. She has the short stature and the very round face and hair, but all those elements together don't necessarily make her a real girl. Camp reimagines things, specifically the world, in an exaggerated way, so much so that it may feel uncanny. It may take something we know and turn it into something else we know, and in a way, repurposing it. In many ways, they don't try to make her look like a real little girl, at least to the audience, and yet in the movie, we still pretend, or the characters still act like she looks like a little girl. And in a way, camp is androgynous. It actively works against heteronormativity. Susan Sontag says, the most refined form of sexual attractiveness consists in going against the grain of one's sex. What is most beautiful in virile men is something feminine. What is most beautiful in feminine women is something masculine. And I think this can also be applied to the way that this movie sort of works against a lot of the different heteronormative ideas that exist within gender roles and what we should think of people like Gemma. I think specifically you can tell that she's a very straight-laced person and that she's very career-driven and doesn't really have any desire to have children. And yet the movie doesn't necessarily position her in a negative light that she should want to have children, but that she grows to enjoy the presence of her niece, which is part of the whole storyline in general. But I do think it's interesting, especially because this movie definitely passes the Bechdel test. If you don't know what the Bechdel test is, it's a certain criteria that has to be reached in order to be, I guess, seen as feminist literature. The Bechdel test, by the way, I'll read it for you, a way of evaluating whether or not a movie or film or other work of fiction portrays women in a way that is sexist or characterized by gender stereotyping. To pass the Bechdel test, a work must feature at least two women. These women must talk to each other, and their conversation must concern something other than a man. And I think we can all agree they don't really talk about men at all in this movie, which is great. And I don't think that this movie intentionally tries to break gender roles or gender stereotypes. And that's what's actually really great about it. The movie just inherently breaks them. The addition of talking about romance or a man or having a man become the hero of the story doesn't even make sense within the confines of the story arc that is trying to be portrayed. It's about an aunt, a niece, and a robot girl. However, that begs the question of meaning. Part of camp has to do with the meaning behind what's going on. In many ways, camp doesn't have any meaning, but can have meaning drawn from it, but not intentionally so. Sort of like what I was saying with it sort of breaking those gender stereotypes that are generally throughout other movies, especially horror movies. Sontag says, equally and by extension, when the word becomes a noun, when a person or thing is a camp, a duplicity is involved. There's almost an exclusivity to camp in that there are outsiders who view it as impersonal and those who find meaning in it. I think this also leads very well into her next point about camp being pure and naive. Sontag says, pure camp is always naive. Camp which knows itself to be camp is usually less satisfying. The work in itself is almost always serious, yet unintentionally camp. Sontag says, one does not need to know the artist's private intention. The work tells all. And that's a lot of what I wonder about M3GAN, is how naive it is to its own campiness. In putting the dance sequence in all of the advertisements, I think it's almost hyper aware that it's trying to be campy because it knows that that is the most ridiculous looking thing to happen in the movie. And the funny part is that if you've seen the movie, this comes out of nowhere. It makes no sense. It doesn't have anything to do with any other event that happens in the movie. There's one other dance sequence, but it's within a montage of Katie and M3GAN hanging out, and all they do is kind of go back and forth, and that's about it. Likewise, there's scenes where M3GAN starts singing a song multiple times. It's very strange and very funny because it literally comes out of nowhere. While Sontag says that the artist's private intentions aren't relevant, I almost feel like it is when it comes to films, because films come from a Hollywood standpoint. Most feature-length films that are coming from Hollywood have 100 people behind them with 100 intentions. Just like many audiences can see when a sequel is a cash grab. Many audiences can sort of suss out a director or just overall a film's intention or intended purpose. Because while there are really jarring moments that are hilarious, there are also moments that are genuinely freaky and weird and strange that give you that standing up of hair on the back of your neck feeling. I also think that camp, in many ways, unironically admits to loving something ironically. It's either unaware completely or aware unironically. And I think the Sharknado movies are a great example of something that is considered campy, like the first Sharknado movie, where they have all of this extravagance and the editing and the acting is so bad and it's so unbelievable, and yet they are still trying as hard as they can to get it to make sense. And when you watch the first movie, it feels like they are trying very hard, that they are serious throughout the whole thing, which makes the movie so much better for camp. However, as soon as you get into some of the later movies where they realize there's a cult following for this series of movies, they start including a lot of celebrities and just important famous people, and it feels a little less like camp because they're so aware of the audience and what the audience is expecting that everyone is now in on the joke. And that's something that I feel camp does. It has this weird exclusivity of knowing the joke, and when too many people get the joke, it's not a joke anymore. And sort of related is that extravagance. Camp is about extravagance. Sontag brings up Eisenstein. If you've seen any of Eisenstein's films, most, I think, popular movie or the most well-known movie is Battleship Potemkin. Sontag specifically says that this movie, or that his films are not camp. Even though they are extravagant and wild and big, they're not camp. And I think that's because it succeeds in being big. If you've seen even the staircase scene from Battleship Potemkin, that whole scene works. That whole scene is serious, and I'm taking it seriously. And likewise, just because there's a lot of effort put into something, just because it took so many years or so-and-so worked so hard on it, doesn't necessarily mean it's camp, because camp includes passion. Another thing that Sontag talks about is time period and the time in which things become campy. Time plays a large role in the changing nature of camp because there is so much to do with fantasy, but when we surpass what is fantastical, it becomes less so. Obviously, there are times like in Back to the Future where they have flying cars and they have all of this crazy technology for their time, which could seem, normal or fantastical for them, and it wouldn't make it camp. And yet, if we look at it now, you might consider something like Back to the Future to be sort of campy in the way that it's extravagant and it's completely serious when doing so. Things can become camp over time. Sontag says, thus, things are campy, not when they become old, but when we become less involved in them and can enjoy instead of being frustrated by the failure of the attempt. So that makes me wonder a lot about M3GAN and if this movie can be seen as campy in this time period. Again, when you get a little too close to reality, like having AI, we already have things like Alexa, and they include things like that in the movie, things that are real. A lot of the devices for the main character Gemma, because she's an engineer and can do that with her household, she is connected to her household at all times just by voice prompts, which is something that exists today. We have smart home products. There's also AI robots that are being introduced, it feels like every single year, where someone has advanced and advanced further to getting closer to having working robots. So I think the fantastical nature of this movie is a little bit lost, and I imagine in the future it will be even more interesting to see how this movie can fit into the genre of camp, if it even does. Another thing about camp is that it's not the opposite of its portrayals. It does not wish to portray good as bad, but good as something other. This is also where you can get a sense of morality, because camp is about aesthetics, not the tension created by morality and immorality. Part of the lesson that is supposed to be learned from M3GAN is not that all AI robots are awful and crazy and will eventually try to kill you. Much of the plot and theme revolves around this human connection aspect. With Katie's parents being deceased, she has to try and work through that grief, and instead of providing a space and a safe haven for Katie to grieve, Gemma decides that she's going to make this AI robot to be her friend and to help her through it, and yet it doesn't actually help. It just makes her bottle up these emotions and try to forget the emotions. M3GAN isn't inherently bad. The times in which M3GAN does things that are supposed to be perceived as bad things and make her the villain don't feel as morally objectionable as one might think. While it is wrong that she hurt the dog in the movie, which you don't see, thankfully, the neighbor does sort of prompt this antagonizing nature of the dog. The neighbor won't patch up the hole or keep the dog on the leash, so the dog keeps coming after and snapping at the neighbors. So if my child gets hurt, yeah, I should be able to sue you. So when M3GAN puts an end to the dog, obviously no one wants to see the dog be hurt, but we do want to see something done about this antagonist. And likewise, the same happens to the neighbor. It's not that you necessarily want the neighbor to be hurt, but you do want the neighbor to stop antagonizing our main characters. The same thing happens in The Woods, and this part is even more interesting to me that they would put it in this specific nature, because it's not anything necessarily that M3GAN has done to make the situation happen. So M3GAN gets stolen by this bully, this boy at this day camp, and so M3GAN eventually tries to hurt the boy, and she actually ends up ripping his ear off. But the problem is that while that's the only thing that M3GAN did to actually harm this boy, the boy runs off and falls down a hill into the street and gets hit by a car. So while this kid didn't necessarily have to die, he did, but not at the hands of M3GAN directly, which again gives us this weird sense of grayness in morality here. Though camp is not serious, it's not necessarily satire or irony. It's unrealistic in the most theatrical way. There's something about experiencing camp that involves a level of detachment, but also a level of involvement that is in a non-bitter way. Sontag says, if tragedy is an experience of hyper-involvement, comedy is an experience of under-involvement, of detachment, and camp is supposed to be comedic. Camp is not supposed to necessarily be analyzed, because it's not supposed to have a much larger, deeper meaning that has some sort of political take or has some sort of moral take on anything in particular. And I think you can kind of see how this works in a theatrical nature in Rocky Horror Picture Show. If you've ever seen it, you can see how Frankenstein, the story, comes through, but you can also see how there's a lot that doesn't make sense, that doesn't need to make sense. There's a lot of things that feel very morally ambiguous, a lot of things that feel outside of the norm, and yet if you understand it, if you get it, then you get it. And if not, you don't. Towards the end, Sontag notes how a lot of camp is also very queer. I think camp and its relationship to queerness specifically has to do with heteronormativity and how that plays into a lot of the media that we consume. And I think M3GAN, in a way, being a meme in the queer community and sort of talking about Slay and her being a killer robot and this weird androgynous nature and sort of detached nature of robots. It's not to say that camp is inherently queer, because it's not, but there's an element that relates to queerness because of the way that you have to view certain media to be able to experience it as camp. Things like Rocky Horror feels queer because it's outside of heteronormativity for a lot of people. Another thing that Sontag talks about is the way that camp can only be experienced in affluent societies because there is room to be bored. Camp taste is upheld by boredom being reconciled. This is all to say that camp is this use of unnecessary things to make us laugh, to make us amused. And it can really only come about from boredom. You can only find this kind of amusement and absurdity through this boredom, through this escapism. Just like camp has to have some sort of fantasy or extravagance, it can't be related to things that we already know. It can't be something that has already been done or something that is part of the norm, because that would make it boring. That's part of the boredom of life. Something like Sharknado is really fun for some people to watch, like myself, because it's so extravagant, it's so far removed from reality that it's just fun. It's just amusing. And finally, the subjectivity of camp. Taste. She says camp asserts that good taste is not simply good taste, that there exists indeed a good taste of bad taste. She also says the man who insists on high and serious pleasures is depriving himself of pleasure. He continually restricts what he can enjoy. All of this to say, if you can't enjoy absurd things, you're depriving yourself of amusement that doesn't take much thought. Camp taste identifies with what it is enjoying. People who share this sensibility are not laughing at the thing they label as a camp. They're enjoying it. Camp is a tender feeling. And that's what I think really encompasses camp, is that there is something personal, something sort of subjective about it, and yet so objective at the same time. I think there are things that are objectively not camp, that you can look at them and say, no, who would ever think this is camp? However, camp is also somewhat a subjective experience, a very individual experience. Just like with Rocky Horror, some people would be appalled and really dislike Rocky Horror, but at the same time, a lot of people identify with it, and it's that subjective nature of being able to have that sort of taste that you can be amused and you can enjoy something for what it is and not have to analyze it. And yes, I know this whole podcast is analyzing film, so like, am I really the one with the taste for camp? It all brings us back to the question of, is M3GAN camp or not? I think I can say for certain that M3GAN is not camp. So M3GAN might be camp, but I'm not sure if M3GAN is camp now or if M3GAN will be camp in 10 years. Likewise, my experience was fun. I enjoyed it and I had a good time, but there were certain points and elements that bothered me or that didn't make sense to me in a not so great way. So I guess it's up to the masses, the majority, to decide if M3GAN is camp, because most campy films or most camp movies have a cult following. So I guess if M3GAN procures a cult following in the way of making fun of it while also not making fun of it, then it could probably be considered camp. So yeah, you'll have to let me know what you guys think, if M3GAN is camp or not. I personally think M3GAN could be camp, but I'm not sure if I would consider M3GAN to be camp as of right now. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and with that, I will see you guys next week.